Hello and welcome back to another Monster Monday, a series where I draw a creature from D&D and I talk about its lore and its mythology and what it's like to fight in-game as well. Last month I asked my patrons to vote on which monsters they'd like to see me draw, and there was an even tie between two different creatures, but I only had time to do one. I only had time to do one Monster Monday last month, so I thought what I would do is make a video about the other creature who tied for top billing, and that means that this time we get to talk about Genies, which I'm hugely excited about. So let's get started with today's video. So today's video was first suggested by Braxton Hudston almost 4 years ago on one of my earliest videos, I think, and I'm so excited to get the chance to finally talk about these guys. A couple of months ago they were tied in top position in one of my Patreon polls to determine what I should be talking about, between that and Camazotz, so I'm glad that I got to talk about both. But Genies are one of these things that I've really wanted to explore because their mythology and their history and their lore always seemed a tiny bit different from what I was given in D&D, and I wanted to get to the bottom of it. But for those who are unfamiliar, Genies, or Jinn, are ancient Arabic supernatural beings of immense power, like demons or angels, and whose magical might and homes are, at least in D&D, tied to the elemental planes rather than celestial or infernal. Much like the most popular representation of a genie, that portrayed by Robin Williams in the 1992 Disney film Aladdin, genies are immensely powerful magical beings capable of granting wishes, and also capable of being bound to the will of another creature, entrapped by magical rituals, or most famously into objects like lamps. Genies were first introduced to D&D players in the monstrous compendium Al-Qadim Appendix for 2nd edition, a Middle East-inspired setting for D&D, released in the same year as the Aladdin film, likely due to the popularity of the genie character. As a result, the air elemental Genie of D&D, and that's D-J-I-N-N-I, rather than Ginny Weasley, have always had a blue-skinned, cloudy-legged appearance in-game, and are usually seen sprouting forth from an oil lamp in most artistic renditions. But air genies are only one of several different types of genies in D&D. Genies are said to be formed in D&D's lore, at least, when the soul of a sentient living creature is cast from its mortal life into the roiling mass of the elemental planes. Most go on to become various creatures who inhabit those realms, but on rare occasions, one may retain some semblance of its form as a mortal and coalesce into the humanoid shape of a genie. These souls rarely have any memories of their former life. Souls are more like the energy of life in D&D, rather than having a personality attached. And it's that mote of life that survives this elemental merging process, rather than the person themselves. The form the genie takes is very much dependent on which of the elemental planes the soul draws energy from. In 5th edition, we're introduced to the earth elemental Dao, the air elemental Ginny, the fire elemental Efriti, and the water elemental Maredi. But previous editions have also included the Jan, elementals composed of all 4 of the classic elements, but whose solidarity and strength was weaker than those more attuned to one specific form of element entirely, the Korashi, relations of Marids, but with a more of a connection to ice specifically rather than water in all of its forms, and also the Kayal, genies whose elemental infusion saw them draw power from the plane of shadows instead of the classic elements. The Dao are earth elemental genies who are obsessed with jewellery, gemstones and gold, desperate to, even with their near godlike wish-granting powers to outshine other Dao even, they can shift earth and stone with ease, allowing them to carve out enormous maze systems and cavernous temples to their own narcissistic grandeur, all glittering with precious and semi-precious stones and ores. They do this specifically to rival one another, hoping to outshine the mazes of other Dao in their magnificence, but their love of gems and their obsessive greed is often their downfall. They cannot resist treasure. While they will never willingly assist a mortal unless they stand to gain something that they treasure, mortals do often trap these beings by luring them to the material plane with extremely valuable gems. These gems are often warded with imprisonment and binding runes which force the Tao to grant wishes for the mortal until released. The genies that we are most familiar with, I'll say, are air elemental genies who are obsessed with beauty and also comfort, often dressing in the finest airy silks to best show off their muscular and well-groomed bodies. They conjure great floating islands into the sky adorned with palaces and great gardens to grow the most luscious fruits and perfumed flowers, all of whose scents are carried across gentle warm breezes that the genie conjures. The life for a genie must be effortless and playful. They love lounging in great cushioned bedrooms, while they play often harmful pranks on mortals from afar. I suppose, a bit like the Fae, the Genie are perhaps the easiest to bind into magical service and to attain wishes from. They love playing pranks that get out of hand, so they will often freely grant wishes if they can twist the wording of a wish to cause ironic or unpredicted punishments, following the letter of the wish, but not the intention. They can also be easily bribed into servitude with gifts, fine food, or even simple flattery. They see their servitude as fated to be and accept it with little fighting, knowing that they will outlive their captors. And even being bound for a mortal's whole lifetime is but a sliver of their own. Not so much for the Ifriti. Ifriti are fire elemental genies who view all other creatures as either enemies or property, dedicating their lives to the art of war and destruction in their tower-like castles, which are usually built atop already towering volcanoes in the elemental plane of fire. They burn open rifts into other planes and raid their inhabitants in brutal displays of warfare and subjugation. While no genie tends to wear much in the way of armour, being creatures composed of raw elemental power, condensing their forms however they so choose to appear, an Ifrit is more likely to display the markings of a warrior. Great, draping silken banners of fabric might pour from their shoulders like lava, and their arms and bodies will likely be covered in a mesh of brass chains and plates, intricately decorative armour exposing much of their burning charcoal black skin. It's nearly impossible to bind an Ifrit to service, or to attain a wish from one. They would rather obliterate any creature that they meet, but the few successful attempts to bind an Ifrit have usually been successful as a result of creating a magnificent, unique and powerful weapon to house their spirit. The Meridi, water elemental genies, are, according to the Monster Manual, quote, the most wondrous, end quote, of the genies, forming elaborate palaces out of coral reefs filled with enormous air-filled chambers. Not so much for themselves, who are largely composed of, and can easily breathe water perfectly well, but for their entourage of slaves or servants, who usually take the form of artists or musicians and other creative performers. Meridi are obsessed with stories, entertainment and luxury, and are said to treat their captives incredibly well, despite, imprisoning them at the bottom of an obsidian sea, or some deep trench for all of eternity. They're most likely to be lured to the material plane by a very skilled bard or an artist, and can be bound most often into conch shells, who, when blown, play beautiful music, or into paintings or flasks of delicious wine. Now, unavoidably, you may have noticed when I was describing the different types of genies there, for one reason or another, the genies of D&D are intrinsically obsessed with slavery. Wizards of the Coast, or at least in the Monster Manual, makes a note that not all of the genies are bad to their slaves, but there's not a good way to own someone, so no matter how neutral genies try to be, they're pretty much universally the bad guys. The idea of the slavery obsession is tied to a genie's own ability to be enslaved, to be bound to an object and forced to lend power or grant wishes and favours until released by their captor. As a result of their nature to be bound, they see the binding of mortals as having a high value. Not necessarily out of vengeance, or at least not always out of vengeance at least, but they see the number of slaves that they have as proportional to their status. Most don't even care to have their slaves for any purpose. Many won't torture them or have them perform manual labour. I mean, why would they? They can shape their environments perfectly well and can conjure limitless wealth, shapeshift and so on. Their power is pretty much limitless. So why would they need slaves to do their bidding? The answer is they don't. They just see their slaves as a number, perhaps even as a currency. The larger their number, the more powerful they are. Often, they wish for their slaves to entertain them, certainly in the case of the Meridi, who basically want to have a constant party going at all times, and therefore enslave people who are likely to entertain them. They might want to have these people praise them, or more often than not, worship them in some capacity. Genies acknowledge the existence of gods, but don't have any affiliation with, and get actively frustrated by those who follow the powers of these creator gods. However, they do tend to change their tune quite considerably if they happen to be worshipped themselves as gods. Genies make great cult leaders, for example. I could see a fantastic adventure that takes the pyramid scheme-like multi-level marketing idea found in modern-day cults, and had a genie at its very top, trying to amass followers, let's say, like an Instagram influencer, and siphoning their power down lower and lower and lower. So if you get a magical telegram in your D&D campaign from someone that you barely remember saying, "Hey bestie," just be aware that it could be a genie in disguise. Hello again. Now, no one likes their video interrupted, so I'll be very, very brief, but I wanted to ask you if you would like and perhaps subscribe, maybe share this video, and take the time to comment down below in the description box. I know you were probably going to do some of those things already, but when I remind you guys, a way greater proportion of people end up doing that stuff, and that really helps the channel because we're only tiny wee. So if, like the genie, you want to grant my wish, then I would really appreciate it if you did that. If you want to go a step further and help the channel even more, help me to make these videos, then I'll leave a link down in my description box to where you can find my Patreon, because these videos take a huge amount of time to make. There's not just the drawing side of things, but there's also all the research and script writing and filming and editing and all this kind of stuff. It's basically a full-time job, and we're like the tiny little coffee shop at the end of your street trying to compete with Starbucks. So if you feel like this content is worth it and you would like to support us, the link is down below in the description box, and there are loads of fun rewards as well. But I'll leave that to you to discover, because I promised this would be brief. So thank you so much for taking the time, and I'll let you get back to your video. Cheers. The origins of the genie, or jinn, D-J-I-N-N, or J-I-N, as they are known in the early pre-Islamic Arabian religions, and systems like them, who hold our earliest known writings of these beings, are actually pretty unclear. I feel like I could be pretty confident in telling you that the idea of the jinn might be the oldest possible incarnation of a spirit or demon that we are likely to encounter on this channel, and are likely where later concepts of demons and angels, spirits and so on sprang from, as they were refined and altered through word of mouth and over the centuries. The original etymology, the root of the word jinn, as far as I can tell, is also fairly unclear, perhaps lost to time even. From the popular Arabic, we can trace the root of this word to early Semitic languages and the word Jan, J-A-N-N, which meant to conceal or to evade, perhaps also to adapt. While the exact nature of the origin is itself concealed in the past, the meaning is fuzzy but more clear, that these beings are in some way hidden from us. Spiritual, invisible, or ethereal, ghostly in some way. The jinn were seen as nature spirits or desert spirits who sprang up from harsh or unsanitary places and were a means for this dangerous cluster of environments to become anthropomorphized and physically lash out at people. But more often than not, the early depictions of these creatures were said to resemble ghostly animals, presumably embodying the creatures who made up those places and who lived in them. Early illustrations of jinn often see them with aggressive lion-like heads and hooves, making them seem quite demonic. It's only later that these spirits took on a more divine and potent, but perhaps less necessarily vengeful aspect in stories. Pre-Islamic religions and cultures, like the ancient Romans, would find a place for the gods and spirits of other faiths in their own in a practice called syncretism. In this way, various pagan gods and deities were included in the foundation of early proto-Islam in the form of Genie. and were seen as spirits that people inhabiting the Middle East were simply less familiar with, rather than something to be opposed or avoided. These others, these outsiders who perhaps believed in or worshipped these gods or spirits, what became the jinn, they weren't wrong, they were just new information, as it were. And there was room in these early faiths to incorporate additional deities, or powerful spirits. Much like the Romans, many Arabic people began to worship these creatures as lesser house spirits or guardians, who are not necessarily immortal, but who nonetheless were worthy of respect, and whom, if offered tribute and praise, were likely to offer protection and magical favours. By the time of the rise of Islam in the 7th century, these creatures were so ingrained in the cultural understanding of the region that they were interpreted as angels, demons, and also their own separate entities entirely. As a result, in Islam, genies are considered generally neutral creatures, born, strangely enough, just like humans, with what's known as frita, an innate sense of purity that seldom few creatures enjoy. In the Muslim faith, this frita, this purity, allows both us and, in the same breath, genies, to choose or reject God's guidance when informed of it. They have essentially free will. This means that the jinn can be considered angelic or demonic depending on their decision, and can therefore be beneficial to encounter. But with the idea of jinn being so absolutely ancient and encompassing the deities of many different religions and cultures, the history and belief in them can span so many different directions. So it's actually really hard to pin down a single narrative or a single idea of what a genie actually is. Early Persian interpretations depicted these creatures as peris, winged mischievous folk, who I also mentioned in my What Are the Fae video, because they likely are the origin of fairies as well. But they're also known in the same culture as devis to these very same people, and took on the more classical blue-skinned, troublemaking magic folk appearance that would later be used to inspire the genie in Aladdin. But while devis were seen as a more negative aspect of the jinn, and peris were seen as generally more positive, they could both magically shift their shape, and their antics largely overlapped, making it actually really hard to tell them apart. In ancient Pakistan, the jinn were divided into the male jinn, Jinn, and the female jiniri. They had their own society and culture. They raised families, procreated much like humans do, worshipped in their own way, and were generally stronger, faster, and larger than humans. In this way, they were treated much more like giants that we might be more familiar with in Norse mythology. They were said to hate the touch of iron and dwelt in long abandoned places where they ate bones and preferred rotten flesh over fresh flesh as their meat. But it's unclear if their food was solely human, or if other animals would sate their appetites. In Morocco, the jinn retained much of their ethereal, ghostly behaviour, and were mostly known for their desire to possess humans and pilot their bodies, requiring exorcisms to remove them from healthy people, and they were, as a result, highly tied to mental illness, and in particular, it was said to be a sign of a jinn if someone suffered from depression. The list goes on, and in each culture they behave and appear very, very differently. Largely, though, their appearances can be roughly summarised into 3 different sort of themes, I guess. They more often than not take on some sort of human-like characteristics. Most early depictions saw them as animals or as raging storms, all of which have a kind of ghostly etherealness to them. Generally, the animal forms of genies, which were by far the most popular stories, represented the creatures of the desert, or who inhabited unsanitary places. As a result, they were often depicted as cats, owls, donkeys, scorpions, snakes, gazelles, foxes, ostriches, or even the very familiar black dog or wolf. They've been known to appear as raging sandstorms and inky shadows in their more energetic and less tangible form. When taking a humanoid form, they almost never, despite D&D's interpretation and the later Aladdin Disney film, take on any fully human shape. They almost always have some element of the animalistic nature about them. They usually retain multiple different animalistic features at once, like a chimera, sometimes having the hands of cats, quote, the heads of birds, or wings rising from their shoulders, end quote, according to a book called Demonic Belief in Islam by Dr. Tobias Nunlist at the University of Zurich. So I was curious, where do the various types of genies in D&D find their origin? Well, if our air elemental djinn are the djinn that most of this information is based on, or genies, then what are the other ones? Well, Ifrits come from the ancient and powerful Ifrit demons of Islamic mythology. The word Ifrit didn't necessarily separate jinn into various different kinds. It was somewhat used interchangeably, but over time did seem to take on more negative connotations. The word Ifrit is believed to stem from the root afra, meaning to rub with dust or to roll in the dust, which, as well as tying them to sandstorms and things that can hurt you and blind you, that genies are somewhat famous for, this all implies an underhandedness and malicious ideology to the Ifrit. The idea of fighting dirty, throwing sand in the eyes, tricking people, and generally being sly. Even then though, Ifrits aren't necessarily evil. They could be tasked with duties which they would fulfill diligently if bargained with. Admittedly, these tasks were usually related to vengeance or avenging murder specifically, but this is likely the origins of genies granting wishes altogether, albeit wishes of vengeance specifically, and it's definitely where we start to see sorcerers binding at least the Ifrit to service. These particular spirits reside beneath the earth and were composed of smoke and fire, which is why we get the fiery Ifrit concept, which has become so popular in both D&D and also in Final Fantasy. Ifrit appears as a deity, I think specifically a fire deity. The Dao were much harder to pin down. Get it? Dao? Down? Yeah, I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. They don't actually seem to have any relation to real-world myths. The Jinn of folklore already have the earth element covered in the form of sandstorms, and the word Dao, as far as I can tell, is really only used in Chinese philosophy, meaning the way, in the sense of a road or a path, perhaps a direction. So in being generous, that's probably related to being grounded, or a well-grounded person. Maybe that's where the makers of D&D got this idea from. In contrast, a Marid does seem to have some type of history to it. It seems to be some type of jinn in Islamic mythology, and a menacing one at that, but they seem to have no particular connection with water as far as I can tell. The whole concept of wish granting seems to stem from 1001 Nights, a collection of Eastern folk tales commonly known as in the West as Arabian Nights, in which the original story that inspired the Disney films of Aladdin eventually became a part. So the different types of genie in D&D present themselves very differently. They're all challenge rating 11 creatures and roughly have comparable stats, although they vary based on their personality and their likely habitat. They also all have access to a variant set of rules, which I don't think any DM is going to ever pass up, part of which has the disguises rule that says that some genies can veil themselves in illusion to pass as other similarly shaped creatures, and they can cast the disguise self spell at will, often with a longer duration than it's normal for that spell to last. Many genies can cast the true polymorph spell 1 to 3 times per day, and possibly with a longer duration than normal. In terms of wishes, we're told that, quote, "The genie's power to grant a wish is legendary among mortals. Only the most potent genie, such as those among the nobility, can do so. A particular genie that has this power can grant 1 to 3 wishes to a creature that isn't a genie. Once a genie has granted its limit of wishes, it can't grant wishes again for some amount of time, which is usually a year, and cosmic law dictates that the same genie can expend its limit of wishes on a specific creature only once in that creature's existence. To be granted a wish, a creature within 60 feet of the genie states its desired effect to it. The genie can then cast the wish spell on the creature's behalf to bring about the effect. Depending on the genie's nature, the genie might try to pervert the intent of the wish by exploiting the wish's poor wording. The perversion of the wording is crafted to be the genie's benefit." So standard DM stuff there, really. Otherwise, individually, the Dao, the Earth Elemental Genies, have somewhat expectedly probably the highest armor class, with 18. They only speak Terran, because why would they need to speak any other languages, and can burrow and fly at 30 feet. Interestingly, they also don't disturb the earth that they glide through, as they can be largely composed of it if necessary. Despite wielding massive hammers, which deal 4d6 plus 6 bludgeoning damage at a time, and being able to punch people as part of a multi-attack, which deals 2d8 plus 6 bludgeoning damage, They're also really good spellcasters, being able to cast Detect Evil and Good, Detect Magic, and Stone Shape at will. 3 times a day they can cast Pass Wall, Move Earth, and Tongues to be able to understand anyone's wish, I suppose. And once a day they can conjure an Earth Elemental, cast Gaseous Form, I suppose rather than gas to turn into pure sand, perhaps. Invisibility, Phantasmal Killer, Plane Shift, and Wall of Stone, as you'd hope, really. The Robin Williams-style air genies are somewhat similar, but can fly 90 feet, being innately tied to the element of air. They can conjure food and water, specifically being able to create wine instead of water in that spell. And they have a scimitar, which they attack with 3 times, which deals 2d6 plus 5 slashing damage, and an additional 1d6 lightning or thunder damage, depending on their choice. One of their actions is called Create Whirlwind, which creates an absolutely massive cylinder of wind within 120 feet that takes a huge amount of strength to not be restrained by this wind and caught up in it. The Ifriti, being the most combat enthusiastic of all the Jinn, get to make 4 attacks rather than 3, 2 with their scimitar, which deals 2d6 plus 6 slashing damage and a further 2d6 fire damage, and they also get to twice use a ranged Hurl Flame ability that deals 5d6 fire damage. Really, I feel like at this point they should be a much higher challenge rating, but I suppose their armor class is still only 17, but that seems like an awful lot of high numbers. The Marid seems to be the least combat effective, I suppose. It has a trident that deals 2d6 plus 6 piercing damage, or 2d8 plus 6 piercing damage if used with 2 hands, and they have a long-ranged water jet that seems to function almost identically to Lightning Bolt, bludgeoning damage and pushing people very far away. Something that I kind of wish was available to spellcasters in general. One of the things that I really like about these creatures is that when they die, they all kind of explode. They have a rule called Elemental Demise. The Marid simply passively turns into a pool of expanding water. The Ifrit disintegrates into a flash of fire and a puff of smoke, apparently. The Jinn turns into a warm breeze, and the Dao disintegrates into crystalline powder, leaving behind only the equipment that the Dao was wearing or carrying. All the Jinn do this, and it seems like a really good way of getting someone to be fabulously wealthy and getting some cool elemental weapons. When you defeat these creatures, they literally leave their gear behind, something that, players might be trying to get the gear of creatures when they defeat them anyway, if you describe them in a particularly cool way or doing fun things. But certainly with a lot of demons and devils, I feel like when they die, they sometimes explode and deal a huge amount of fire damage, and their weapons just sort of puff into nothingness. But it's kind of cool that you can take on the mantle, the clothes, the gold, the wealth, and the weapons of a Jinn if you happen to defeat them. Now, in terms of how I wanted to make the drawing today, I was torn about which kind of genie I wanted to draw. I feel like the air elemental Jinn are the ones that are most commonly drawn, but then they're also the ones that I talked about most in this because they're the only ones that are really genies, and the other ones are kind of slightly either different ways of saying genie that D&D has largely then projected more stuff onto, or something like that. I don't know. Either way, it felt right to draw them anyway, but I really wanted to tap into this kind of cloud of smoke manifesting as a person. I wanted to have all their wealth, all of their things, all of their objects, all of the things that they value, making them up because they make up so much of their personalities, rather than necessarily having a quite human-like form. I wanted their objects to make almost like the mirage of their form. I also really wanted to tap into this animal aspect. For so much of history, they were described purely as animals and nothing related to people. And then later, when they were described as humanoid, they were never described as human. They were described as human-animal hybrid creatures. I feel like the depiction that we have of genies is so infused with the Disney's Aladdin, which, nothing wrong with Disney's Aladdin. It's a great cartoon, it's a great film. I grew up with that when I was younger, but I always like tying in the sort of original references and the origins of these creatures into my illustrations of them, especially if it adds something that I feel isn't often represented. So I decided to go for a donkey's skull as the kind of mask here. I also thought about the idea of giving this huge sort of scorpion-like pincers, but that ended up not looking too right. It ended up looking very busy, so I decided to pay tribute to that by having a little kind of scorpion as her shoulder plate here, and I wanted her armour to not necessarily be practical but be hugely extravagantly wealthy. Look, by these large plates of gold. At the end of the day, she doesn't need any armor. These kind of bandages and armor plates and clothing are just there to give her some kind of semblance of form. She is an air elemental. She doesn't need to look like anything, really, especially with her phenomenal magical power. But I really like what I came up with here, and I hope you did too. If you enjoyed today's video, please make sure to leave a little like, a little thumbs up down below, perhaps favourite this video, and share it with the rest of your community. That would be my one wish if I were to have a genie right now, because we really need your help to grow the channel, and I can only do that with help and support. If you'd like to get more out of the channel, I've been making lots of playlists of all of my different videos so that you can kind of binge watch things based on different topics. Be sure to leave links down in my description box. But also, if you just go to my channel page, you can go to the playlist section and find lots of other ones, including things like all of my Dragon December videos or all of my Fae videos, things like that. Otherwise, I hope you'll subscribe so that you don't miss any more videos like this that I make. I've got loads of really exciting content coming out soon. And until next time, happy monster hunting. Good luck and goodbye.